Merci, je crois qu'on peut commencer. M. Dadouche va certainement nous rejoindre très rapidement. Je crois qu'on va peut-être parler en français, ce qui est la grande majorité, je crois, des participants autour de la table. Et la traduction est assurée pour ceux qui préfèrent l'anglais. Alors, très rapidement, on a signé en mars dernier à Kigali, sous la présidence du président en exercice de l'Union africaine, Paul Kagame, cet accord extrêmement important qui vise à la constitution d'une zone de libre-échange sur l'ensemble du continent. Je comprends qu'à ce jour, 49 pays ont déjà signé, mais simplement 10 ont ratifié, alors qu'il en faudrait 22 pour que l'accord devienne opérationnel. Et les poids lourds du continent, que sont l'Afrique du Sud et le Nigeria, semblent encore, pour le moins, hésitants. Sans compter qu'aujourd'hui, on assiste, et c'est un sujet dont on a largement débattu aujourd'hui, depuis le début de la conférence, la contagion du repli sur soi, ou du country first, dont on espère qu'elle ne va pas gagner la totalité du monde. Alors, on espère beaucoup de cet accord. On espère d'abord qu'il renforcera considérablement les échanges intra-africains, qui ne sont simplement aujourd'hui que de l'ordre de 19%, là où les échanges entre les pays européens sont de l'ordre de 70%. Does it work, the translation? Can you please check? Est-ce que vous pouvez regarder si la traduction marche, s'il vous plaît? On en espère aussi qu'il va contribuer à mettre en place des économies locales bien davantage créatrices de valeur ajoutée locale et surtout d'emplois locaux. La problématique de l'emploi aujourd'hui sur le continent est certainement son challenge le plus considérable. Je rappelle que 60% de la population du continent a moins de 25 ans, que dans les 10 prochaines années, on attend 750 millions de demandeurs d'emploi supplémentaires. Et l'indice Ibrahim, qui sera publié lundi, montre que, alors que la croissance économique du continent sur les 10 dernières années, la croissance du PIB a atteint pratiquement 50%, 49%, le progrès en matière de développement économique durable a été pratiquement nul. Donc il y a un vrai problème aujourd'hui, qui est celui de l'emploi qui va être offert aux jeunes générations qui arrivent de façon massive sur le continent. Et puis c'est enfin celui de la création d'une véritable autonomie ou souveraineté économique après les indépendances politiques. Alors qu'en est-il? Is it still not working? No, but I can speak English if you... Okay, so shall I switch to English until translation is working, maybe? I'm sorry about that. So, how is it working today? What can we say about this agreement? Because we all know that devil is, if not in the details, at least in implementation. Political commitment are there, but most difficult now is in front of us, how to implement this agreement. What are the main obstacles? What are the conditions that need to be put in place to really begin to implement that? I will maybe begin by give the floor to Uri Dadouche, if you agree with that, to present us the main situation today. And also, how do you see this as a very strong and powerful tool for the development of this continent we're all waiting for and have been sort of heralding for now a long time? Thank you.
Yeah, sorry I was late. The plenary has just finished. I didn't know it started, so I apologize. Yeah. So this initiative is important for the continent. It also provides a nice counterpoint to the protectionism that is arising in different parts of the world. It's definitely needed because Africa is fragmented, and trade within Africa is a very small part of the total trade of Africa. It's very difficult to imagine that Africa can break out onto world manufacturing markets and become competitive in a lot of internationalized industries, which are essential for its development, unless it has a critical mass of a market that it addresses. And as the Economic Commission for Africa has pointed out, not only the trade that is within Africa at the moment tends to be trade in manufactured products or agricultural products, and the trade that is outside of Africa tends to be of what they call extractables, so natural resources. And that is a promising sign that if you could get more integration within Africa, you could develop more of agriculture and industry within Africa. It is quite surprising, as an economist, when I approached this issue for the first time about 9 months ago, to see how many barriers there are within Africa. So it's ironic that African countries have very high tariffs with each other in relative terms, but they actually trade quite freely with the European Union and with the United States. So there's a kind of trade diversion that is occurring, which is orienting in an artificial way trade outside of Africa instead of inside of Africa. One other point I would make is that we must not make the error in Africa that we made when we did the Middle East, North Africa agreements with the European Union, which is to assume that because you do the free trade agreement, automatically you're going to solve a lot of problems and get a lot of growth, etc., etc. So long experience and many studies have shown that in the language of economists, there is no unconditional convergence. It isn't just because you open trade that you converge to the higher income of your partners, whatever that might be. Convergence, international trade liberalization only works in conjunction with strengthening of domestic policies. If you don't have the strengthening of domestic policies, frankly, you can do all the trade liberalization that you want. If you don't have the political stability, if you don't have peace, in a lot of places in Africa there isn't peace, and if you don't have a reasonable predictability of the business climate, I'm talking about corruption, I'm talking about governance, etc., etc., you are very unlikely to get investment in that kind of context, whether trade is open or not. In fact, sometimes I have made the argument that if you don't have those domestic conditions, trade can actually hurt you, because all that happens is you get a lot of imports, but you don't get the export response. Okay. Now, in terms of the agreement itself, that's the general point. In terms of the agreement itself, what are the conditions for its success? The first, again, I stress, is improvement in domestic policies and governance. That's the first condition for the success of the African Continental Free Trade Area, and it's a very important thing that should happen irrespective of the African Continental Free Trade Area. That I take as given. The technicalities of the agreement, there are 3 points that need to be recognized. Number one, the agreement has to be inclusive. Right now, I would argue it is pretty inclusive. I don't remember the exact numbers, but something like 45 or 46 countries have now signed on to the agreement, except for the elephant in the room so far, and that's Nigeria. Now, a few months ago, the president of Nigeria made a statement, I think it was in Ouagadougou, that he was going to sign the agreement. The agreement, as far as I know, has not been signed. I just checked this morning. And there's a lot of debate within Nigeria about signing it. So it's very important that Nigeria signs it. I want to say a word about Nigeria, why it's such a complicated. Of course, it's the biggest economy in Africa. So without Nigeria, it's kind of difficult to see how this thing functions as an African agreement. But Nigeria, the political economy in Nigeria is extremely complicated. It's an oil exporter, and but it has a domestic manufacturing and agricultural output, of course, which is uncompetitive, in part because of the oil exports and the Dutch disease effects. But Nigeria, as I like to stress, is not Saudi Arabia. Nigeria is the oil resources of Nigeria relative to the population of Nigeria, which is 200 million people, is tiny. Okay, so Nigeria cannot be like the Gulf states, thinking it's going to, just take its time to develop using oil resources. It has to diversify its economy, and it has to diversify its economy now. So it's very important for Nigeria, not to mention all the geopolitical considerations of it being, if it wants to be a leader in the continent, it has to be part of this agreement. So that's a first condition, is Nigeria has to join. The second and third conditions are quite technical. The second condition is the agreement says we will liberalize 90% of trade. But they don't specify what that means. If it's 90% of trade, actual trade volumes, etc., that's not too bad. But if it's 90% of tariff lines, then countries can play a lot of games in choosing the appropriate tariff lines under which they're not gonna liberalize, and essentially negate the effects of the agreement. Okay, and the third technical point is that rules of origin are very important in free trade agreements. So for those of you who have not had the pleasure of studying rules of origin, it's basically if a product comes in from Ghana into Kenya, is it really a product from Ghana or is it a product from China? Okay? And so you need rules of origin in order to make sure that the free trade agreement is not abused, so to speak. Okay, but these rules of origin, if they're made to be very complicated, specific to particular products, depending on the production process, or how many times it's been transformed, etc., it can become very, very difficult for people to comply with the rules of origin. And so it's important that the rule of origin be simple, especially in an African context where you have a lot of governance issues. And so something like a value-added criterion, like 50% of value-added has to be within Africa, and there's accumulation wherever it is produced in Africa. I think that's an important third condition. Finally, I just want to say the other big issue, which is impossible to separate from trade policy, is the infrastructure question. So anybody who's familiar with Africa knows that it is a gigantic continent. The distance between Casablanca and Johannesburg is 8,000 kilometers, which is about the distance between Brussels and Beijing. But this is a continent that is very poor in all of its transportation infrastructure, whether you're talking about roads, ports, airports. It's very weak in that regard. So the African Continental Free Trade Area, in order to work, has to be accompanied by a stepped-up effort of all concerned, and that means includes the Chinese, doesn't just include the Europeans or the Americans, because the Chinese are very good at infrastructure. It has to be accompanied by a major effort to scale up the infrastructure, particularly in the area of transportation.
Okay, thank you very much for this very complete presentation. Listening to you, I have the impression that there are more obstacles yet to jump over, because before we can begin to implement the agreement, especially coming from Nigeria, Because if we listen to you, Nigeria still has to tidy up its domestic economy before being able to join. So it's not very encouraging as a view, but we'll come back to that. Elizabeth, may I now turn to you and ask you as our most expert in Europe to tell us what you can tell us about the example of European Union, which basically was built at the beginning on economic interest with the SECA. Are there best practices that we could share with our African partners and friends? Are there also bad policies that they could make the economy of? How can we somehow, how have we arrived to Brexit? Is that something that could happen in Africa if we don't pay enough attention to the people who are going to be the first consumers and the first, I would say, beneficiaries of this agreement? So thank you for your wisdom on that.
Well, thank you, Nathalie. So I understand we cannot speak French.
I tried.
Hein?
I tried. But we have a translation issue.
Non, mais pourquoi? On peut ou on ne peut pas parler français?
Okay, so I'm sorry.
La traduction, ça y est? La traduction a repris. Alors, si vous permettez, je vais parler français. Merci, Nathalie.
It seems that it's only the person who.
C'est juste la personne qui n'écoute pas le français, donc je demanderai à mon ami de traduire. L'interprétation est assurée. There is interpretation into French and into English. Kindly confirm receipt. No, I will certainly not pretend and say that Europe can actually give lessons to Africa. I would love to say the opposite. I believe that one should come out of this attitude whereby Europeans should be patronizing unto Africa, and I believe that much to the contrary. If one wishes to have French-African and European relations, that will be up to the challenges we have to face together. Therefore, we need to think out another partnership between equal parties, and if you get inspired by best practices, you're absolutely right, and also to learn from what hasn't worked for your Africans and in European, or what hasn't worked in Africa. It would be a natural thing. However, I wish to insist on relations between Europe and Africa. We hear many people say in France that Africa could be for Europe either a dream or a nightmare. However, what I see is that populists in Europe, all over Europe right now, do insist on the fact that Africa is going to be a nightmare for Europeans. This is their goodwill, or their business, which has always been for extremists to prop up fears without proposing any solutions, and therefore they would take an argument of the fact that the population growth in Africa is so greater than economic expansion in spite of the dynamism of Africa. And in Africa you can create sufficient number of jobs to employ the youth who come on the job market every year. We're talking about 200 million unemployed youth every year if you don't create jobs, and therefore extremists are going to say that they will go and feed instability and insecurity in Africa, which is considerable, and also feed into traffics, and this is the language they use, or simply swarm onto Europe. I don't believe that on the European side one should ignore such fears. There is a population imbalance, and it should be addressed front ahead. However, you do have in Europe fears that generate from greater distance. For example, the fear of the loss of influence, of decline, and this has been discussed extensively since yesterday. Europeans must get used to become countries of immigration, whereas in the past. They used to generate immigrants. They must get used to no longer dominate the world. And on the African side, there is also vis-a-vis Europe this resentment, which still is felt and should be understood, as it is or rooted in colonialism and neo-colonialism, which has continued to sway after independences. All of this are impediments to constructive development of relationship between Europe and Africa. However, the issue is if such fears were to dominate, if you do not respond to such discourses that are exacerbated by populists, then Europe is going to close up to Africa, and if Africa, through its requirements in terms of infrastructure and important and swift funding and financing, will sell itself to China. To be blunt, and there will be a time when there will be considerable damage on both sides. And Europe, therefore, will durably be dominated by populists, as you will see in Italy, and this is because populists are incapable of providing real answers to the problems of people. It will feed a lot more dissolution and will cause autarcy. And Africa, on its side, as it in the short term, they are looking for financing. At one point in time, they will have to pay, and they will be increasingly in debt. This is a concern. I would say that there is no fatality, much to the contrary, with regard to this nightmare. I believe that Africa and Europe could build together win-win relations, and this on both shores. So how? Or first, why? Because there are obvious complementarity. When you have an aging Europe that needs to have manpower and young blood, on the other hand, you have a boiling Genesis. So obviously in Europe and for Africa there will be opportunities in terms of training, in terms of technological development, and such complementarities can give way to positive synergies. And also there are common mutual challenges that could only be successfully faced if there are cooperative strategies between Europe and Africa. This is not only just a challenge in terms of the employment of youth, but also the challenge of artificial intelligence, the control and mastery of mobility, because mobility is going to increase with development. This has been demonstrated for ages, and therefore if Africa develops, mobility will be greater, and we will be absolutely sentenced to manage this together. I believe that we should actually co-manage this movement of population so as to be able to master it and regulate it without closing everything, and organize legal avenues for mobility on both sides. And also we need to fight together all types of insecurity and successfully face the challenge of ecology. So how can this be done? First, it seems that Europe and Africa should assume their respective responsibilities and not just throw and blame a responsibility and blame one another constantly. I believe that Europe should nowadays further invest in Africa and not just be content with trade, buy raw materials, process them in Europe and resell them. This doesn't create many jobs in African countries. Trade is nice, but you cannot simply rely on this, and there need to be investments from the private sector. And unfortunately, international assistance has fed what you denounce. Governance can also give way to corruption in Africa. This is the responsibility of Africans, and you did insist extensively on such, but it is extremely important. It seems that this could be done simply by seizing an opportunity before us, which is to negotiate the post-Cotonou agreements. So far, it is very little visible. However, you have a deadline in 2020. So far, those Cotonou agreements serve as a pitch and putt where you had all of the issues, but we should deal with the issues of Europe and Africa separately with four requirements. A political strategy that should be defined and accepted on both sides, and a partnership between equal parties where we would put proposals on the table, or if we have true political discussions between decision makers. And secondly, we need to have joint production agreements in the key sectors that we all know. Food processing, energy, ecology, digital technologies, health and education. There should be absolutely a bank or a group of banks to secure investment and capital mobility. The existing banks are turning this into the priority, and it so seems at the end that we'll go back to this issue. There should be a foundation, as this is the case, between the countries of Asia, China, and the countries of Southern Asia, as on the American continent, as we do here within WPC, but in a permanent manner, where you would bring together experts, researchers, political decision makers, corporate executives to figure out and think the future. What is it that we should do in order to maximize our opportunities together? Now it close in this fashion. Not only should one work on the economy, but work on cultural dialogue, because what is the fear of Europeans? It is related to their identity, and so it is on the African side. So if we continue to live with the idea that there is a clash of civilizations, that we mix religion with all of this, with tremendous confusion, we will not do away with these shortcomings. There is a clash of ignorance, as a philosopher says. However, we are duty-bound without erasing differences. Differences make you rich. And therefore, what brings Africans and Europeans together, there is history that has experienced some good times. The human bonds represent a formidable source of wealth. We don't take advantage of such, and all of this should serve further to promote public dialogue. We're not going to talk only of disasters, because within the Annalen Euro-Mediterranean Foundation, we commission studies every 3 days. Our societies expect that we shed light on what brings us closer and not what divides us. And when we ask them with regard to those issues that are being exploded constantly in the populist discourse, we measured this, and I would say that yes, people say, yes, well, war, xenophobia and whatnot, but let's face it, this is not what matters most. I just wanted to say this afternoon that the issues of Europe are one thing, they should be settled, but Europe has turned out to be much more resilient with regard to Brexit, which would be much more an issue for the United Kingdom than it would be for the European Union, even though it is a weakening objectively for both. And here, I think that in reality we don't have any other choice than to try and work together within a different state of mind, which would reflect a certain presence. Thank you, Elizabeth, for the general analysis that sets out the background for our talk. And there is also the issue of renegotiating the Cotonou agreements. One has to be vigilant and make sure that this renegotiation would actually favor the implementation of a free trade agreement. This is what we should pay attention to. Mustafa Tarab, Mr. Chairman, if you please, I wish to know whether you can share with us the point of view of the private sector of Morocco, which is playing a leading role on the African continent, and how to convince those who are resisting in resisting countries, because by the end of the day there is no saleable public policy should it not rest on interest, not only on moral duty, on collective loyalty, and our collective ability to demonstrate the interest of such an agreement for people, for individuals, for citizens, would be something fundamental. One says that some fear that the implementation of such agreements may introduce gaps in terms of competitiveness, whereby they would undermine or destroy some economic areas of some countries. So how do you solve the issue? How do you convince those who are resisting? Does it take solidarity mechanism? How do you demonstrate this interest? And if you please, how do you do so in the area of agriculture? I believe that we are here a great number to believe in the African agricultural potential, where yield is going to increase, whereas production is decreasing.
So, the Prime Minister will appreciate, I'm sure. But well, the last time I made a mistake of accepting to speak in the same conference as Uri Dadouche was 30 years ago. What's left to say after what you've said, Madame Guigou said? So you're right, Nathalie. Let me, this 30,000 feet overview that you gave, I cannot compete with. So I'm going to go to 0 feet and indeed talk about agriculture, and even more precisely about our own experience in fertilizer and what we can draw from it. But basically, I think what it had showed us is the importance of the right policies. So beyond, and you mentioned them, beyond making sure there is investment that goes along with free trade, I think one of the prerequisites is good policies, if not the most important ingredient. Indeed, we have to ask ourselves, what good is free trade if we cannot, within the continent, produce the goods and the services that we will trade? Today we are mainly, and you mentioned it, in extractive industries and extractive trade. That extractive trade is to benefit economies outside the continent that have developed the transformation capabilities to be able to consume the raw materials. Africa, to a large extent, has not. So we certainly are not going to trade natural resources amongst ourselves. We do not have the capabilities to transform them in the continent. And the agriculture, in particular fertilizer, was a case in point. The African green revolution requires fertilizers. The continent has all the natural resources to produce its own fertilizers, yet up until 10 years ago it was exclusively exporting these natural resources to fertilizer producers outside the continent, having to import back the finished products at sometimes 5-6 times the international price, because they would, they would get, I will not go into details, but this was the situation. Again, the same for many other goods. So, continental free trade, CFTA, of course, but what are the microeconomic policies, sectoral, to deal with the value change that will actually create a reality in terms of this trade? So I promise to stay at the ground level. This is what I will do. I'll just mention an experience, and I'm very happy that the Prime Minister is here, because when we started looking at the an African corporation to the African fertilizer market. We started with Ethiopia. Ethiopia, like Morocco, used to fully import its fertilizer from outside the continent. And if we're looking at encouraging industrialization, processing activities in the continent in many sectors, let's not forget that industrial revolutions always started with agricultural revolutions, with green revolutions in many other economies. So it is of interest to the continent to really think seriously about its green revolution and whether it will lead to agribusiness, to processing, and to broader agricultural value chains within the continent. So I'll take you to the movies for a minute. Can we really talk about the African Green Revolution? Many NGOs, international organizations focus on this. There is absolutely no green revolution experience in any other continent, India, Brazil, and others, that didn't start with fertilizer policy. So here's where the continent sits in terms of fertilizer consumption. Average world consumption is here. Arguably, there is overconsumption in China, for example, well recognized by policymakers. But what's important is that translates into this, into very low agricultural productivity. So when we started deciding that to increase this, it was important. It was in fact sine qua non that we can produce our own fertilizer in the continent, not just import them, for price reasons, but also for other reasons. We started making fertilizers that are with African natural resources, but also customized to the African soil and the African crops. And here's what happened. Talking about, has it started? We are seeing phenomenal growth in fertilizer consumption in many African countries. The policymakers 10 years ago in Abuja, the heads of states, decided to set a target of 50 kilograms per hectare as a reasonable target. World average, again, I remind you, is more than 100 kilograms per hectare. So this is reasonable target. Yet today, only Ethiopia is coming close to it. Many other countries are far from it, but with very high growth rates today. Something very similar to the mobile revolutions 15 years ago, 20 years ago. But why? The ingredient was customized fertilizer, was indeed giving ourselves the possibility to manufacture in the continent the right fertilizer for our conditions, and then trade these fertilizers within the continent. And it started with soil fertility maps, doing the right formulas of fertilizer, not the imported ones. We did that in many countries, but let me just end on the Ethiopian example, because it is an example also of the right policies. We did soil fertility maps. This was co-financed with the Gates Foundation and the Agricultural Transformation Agency of Ethiopia, very much under your leadership, Excellency. Ethiopia used to consume imported DAP, absolutely standard fertilizer. And we did field trials, and we saw that the new fertilizer, the one that came out of this analysis, had much higher productivity than the DAP, the important fertilizer. This is actual field tests. Now, this fertilizer is 40% cheaper than this one. And with the right policies, and this hasn't happened in other countries, the consumption of fertilizer in Ethiopia shifted from I wouldn't call it the wrong fertilizer, but the less adapted fertilizer to the right fertilizer. We're doing this in many countries. I showed countries with strong growth. This is our last experiments in Ghana. Standard fertilizer, new adapted fertilizer. And I think this is the key to it's, you have to have both a trade view, but it has to be complemented with actually policies to improve the value chains and selective, I would say, appropriate policies on economic and industrialization in Africa.
Thank you very much. Je tourne maintenant vers vous, Monsieur le Ministre.
I now turn to you, Mr. Minister. You're the Secretary of State for Investment, Industry and Commerce and Digital Economy. So you're at the heart of the device that serves to implement public policies so as to successfully implement this agreement. What can you say in terms of your experience within the ministry? What will be the main obstacles, or rather the chief conditions to the implementation of this agreement in terms of the implementation of those policies? Thank you, ma'am. Well, good afternoon, y'all. I'm very pleased to be with you because this is a very important subject on which we do have a number of preconceived ideas that may stir our discussion towards a depressive storytelling. This has to be clearly understood. My experience, for example, in Morocco, and I'll give you a very important symbol, where African migrants that would transit through Morocco or would reside in Morocco, an NGO, GADAM, has actually studied the level of indication and the sociology of those migrants. It turns out to be that they are more educated than Moroccan migrants. GADAM sends out a very important message when we say African youth is the oil of the 21st century. It's been used many a time, we've never seen it, and therefore the example says, look, Africa gives far more opportunities than what one imagines. The second point, why is it that these better trained people go to migrate in Europe or in Morocco? Simply because the prerequisites that you talked about are still not in place. I'll give you an example. If you're in Cotonou, and if you have a container that you wish to send 1,200 miles or kilometers to the north, it costs you 2.5 the price for sending this container to Shanghai, from Shanghai to Cotonou. And this globalization has actually been based on extroversion. This was what was said in terms of phosphates 10 years ago, and there is a tremendous number of industries that are still present in Africa. The bad news is the industrial added value in Africa is decreasing. Between the years of 2012 and 17, this industrial added value has dropped from $70 million. On the same period, it has been increased by 16% with regard to Morocco. I'll talk about Ethiopia. It has increased its industrial added value. Some examples show that this is possible, and others show that there are real constraints on the field. I can talk about the lack of infrastructure, and ma'am, you talked about the role in all of this, and I believe that what the Chinese have done with regard to Europe and launching the One Belt, One Road initiative, we need the same effort for Africa if we are to build this north-south economic corridor. And we're talking about transport infrastructure, digital communication, and logistical infrastructure will help many Moroccans succeed. We simply need to put in the conditions. So this north-south corridor, we don't wait for the Europeans to build it. We're not going to do it. Let us take on our responsibilities in our modest level in Morocco. You have the new model for the development of the southern provinces, which is a minimal or a small mini development strategy of $7 billion to extend transportation infrastructure from Tangier to Dakhla. You have the highway all the way to El Ayoun, the largest bus terminal in Africa that will connect Lagos and Abidjan to the Moroccan port of Tangier Med. And in Mali, I don't have the exact figure, but most of the mango crop, it gets wasted. This is the real problem. But to go back to the issue of trade, this may be my shortcoming, but it should be trade should serve the purpose of industrialization. The ministry does it every day. They have the choice between trade and industry, import goods or manufacture them on location. This is the arbitration we need to have in Africa. And in terms of the negotiation power that you talked about earlier, it's excessively important. When the Africans negotiate with the European Union, they do it in isolation, and when these countries were not necessarily ready to have the required expertise to conduct these negotiations and to use governance systems that were not optimal.
Qui négocie avec un ensemble de 500 millions qui est démocratique, ben je peux vous dire que la négociation n'est pas équilibrée parce que les circuits de décision sont réputés très courts dans le pays non démocratique, alors que ceux d'en face peuvent dire attention, je ne peux pas m'engager, j'ai mon Parlement européen qui va me dire, j'ai mon Parlement truc, j'ai mes ONG qui vont me dire, donc je complexifie le circuit de décision et ça fait qu'il y a une inégalité dans le pouvoir de négociation de ces accords de libre-échange. Je voudrais dire une autre chose, c'est que dans le domaine de l'industrie, il y a des possibilités extraordinaires. Au Maroc, on commence à peine. C'est l'enfance de l'art, la politique industrielle au Maroc. On a commencé, on a des premiers résultats, mais c'est vraiment l'enfance de l'art. Il faut qu'on regarde l'exemple. L'exemple, pour moi, c'est ce qu'ont fait les pays asiatiques, et notamment les pays de l'ASEAN plus 3. Vous savez que cet économiste japonais Kaname Akamatsu qui a théorisé le vol d'oies sauvages. Donc l'idée c'est de dire que quand un pays s'industrialise, en montant en gamme et en diversifiant ses produits, il doit pouvoir compter sur ses pays voisins à démographie plus jeune, à salaire plus compétitif, pour prendre le relais de ces chaînes de valeur industrielles.
Industrial chain, I would believe that Morocco would have successfully implemented this when Abidjan will market its products in Morocco, and this is the case for Japanese plants when they sell their products in different ports in Africa. If you extend this chain of value to African countries, because you have this rapport from the north to the south, you have a corridor from the east, from Egypt to Kenya as well, into the center from Tunisia towards Nigeria and the Central African Republic, it will be according to this rationale that we have to work, a geostrategy rationale whereby such corridors will be necessary, and an FTA will never work without territorial complementarity or continuity. The agreement of Agadir should actually extend this all the way from Morocco to Jordan, but if you don't have this territorial complementarity, it would be impeded by logistics. The best example is Algeria. We produce cars, and the Renault plant in Oran imports semi-finished vehicles from Romania, so we lose opportunities. This is with regard to industry. One of the advantages or the benefits of Africa is that if we want to build a non-fragmented and integrated market, it takes barriers to entry. In the African continent, I see such, notably in the research and development. You have many global multinationals that have launched projects in Africa and have failed because they did not adapt their goods and services to the African context. I'll give you an example. That of fertilizers of OCP is extraordinary. What has OCP did? R&D. It adapted its product to African reality, enhanced its success. Look at digital technology. If you buy a sensor or a captor to put on a machine, if you buy it, it is made in Europe or in the US, but it is made to operate in an environment where you have high-speed internet. But if you bring it to Morocco, Côte d'Ivoire, and elsewhere, internet is a little slower, and it would be interrupted intermittently, and therefore you would have holes in databases. So This is what a Moroccan startup has done. They've created a captor but with a flash memory, so even if you don't have internet, data continues to be mined. This is a slight improvement so as to have the product adapted to your reality. I'll give you the example of Kalashnikov. Easy to maintain, more successful on its market. That's exactly this, the need to turn to work on R&D and adapt the product to the African context is a barrier to entry that should be turned into an opportunity for Africa. Another source of hope, the rate of women that would actually successfully get their high school degree is greater by 6% than that of men. It is up to 26% now, and in sub-Saharan Africa, the rate of employment of women is at 65%. So we have a society, matriarchal, inclusive society, that would have a number of assets that should lead it forward. Free trade is a tool, not an end in itself, to reach this development. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup pour cette vision très pragmatique.
Thank you, very pragmatic and full of hope. Even if you take Morocco as an example compared to other countries that are less advanced than you are. There's a long way still to be covered, but we may manage. We can manage. Mrs. Chutley, you are the voice of the civil society that was mentioned by the minister. Could you tell us, from your viewpoint, practical viewpoint, and based on your contacts with the everyday people that are not in ministries or in big companies, how do you see this free trade agreement? Do you have the feeling that it brings a positive thing, or is it alarming?
No, that's fine. Okay. That's fine, thank you. To tell the truth, it's rather alarming for a lot of the reasons that have been stated earlier. Clearly, for something like this to succeed, I mean, in theory, of course, it is wonderful, and we hope by 2063 you will have something to sort of show for it. However, I think in our current...
Est-ce que vous pouvez parler un peu plus dans le micro parce que je crains que tout le monde ne vous entende pas.
Could you please speak closer to the microphone? Thank you.
Okay, I'll start again. Sorry. I said, frankly, on a personal level, I feel it's rather alarming. I think that from the heart, I feel it's alarming. From the head, of course, it's something aspirational, and by 2063, hope that we shall be able to really witness this enormous transformation of our beloved continent. However, the realities on the ground are we tend not to have strong domestic policies within our countries, particularly as they pertain to our public policies which cover health and education. We're having increasing inequities in our countries. We have security issues, major security issues. We have weak infrastructure. I don't want to repeat everything that's been said, but from the little that I understand, there would be a need to have some degree of a secure political union for there to be a successful outcome of this agreement. And I found it not surprising that Nigeria was held back, given the security challenges Nigeria is going through, given its poor investment in its human capital, given its poor infrastructure, notwithstanding its potential. But it's not just about Nigeria. This happens even with some of the countries that have signed up to the agreement. And I think that what I found most interesting was when my colleague Elizabeth was speaking about the need to establish a new order of engagement, if you will, an investment in the personnel of Africa, I think this is an opportunity for the Europeans to perhaps to start investing and assisting in the domestic investment of our youth, the same youth that we describe as the oil of the 21st century. But what are they growing up in at the moment? We really have to build our domestic policies to have a much sounder social contract between the state and the populations. They just don't exist right now. And I think they are critical. All of the things that have been said notwithstanding, I think at the end of the day, it's going to be our failure to invest in our populations that is going to be the Achilles heel of this. Kudos to Morocco for what it's doing with its population and its women in particular. But Ghana has recently, we lost a huge champion in our agricultural revolution, as you know, who was also a personal friend. But beyond that, just before he died, the Ghana government very proudly announced that it was going to invest 1% of its GDP in STEM education. I mean, I was flabbergasted personally after all the lobbying we've done and the agreement that seemed to be there that it was important for us to start looking more seriously at the type of education we're offering.
For both males and females to turn around and do that, but Ghana's no exception. And I think that we've got to start putting our money where our mouths are. I listened to the discussion on the European Union and the possible future of the euro, thinking about this as I was listening to it, and it really reinforced my fears, because it's the trust issue, the unity issue, the safety and security issues. I mean, these are all the areas that we're weakest on this continent, and so to have any reasonable semblance of movement of trades, goods, services and people is just still a pipe dream. And I'm sorry if I'm coming across a little bit pessimistic, but we've weakened our investments in our young, not strengthened them over the past years, mostly on the continent, with various reasons, some of the reasons being valid. But we've got to reverse this if we're going to be able to really see us investing in this manner, in this way. Again, I shan't repeat some of the things that were said, but a lot of important things did come up. I'll see if there was anything. I think the rules of origins being made simple is very important. Definitely looking at what happens already on the continent, where China is both our friend and potentially may cause complications down the road with something like this. I think that's all I really would have to say. And it's not about education. I mean, we have how youth are educated. We just don't have the jobs for them. We don't have the appropriate jobs for them. And again, this is going to become increasingly a critical problem. It is, but it's going to become even more so unless we have a real serious attempt to invest in them, both on the domestic front and perhaps with the Europeans beginning to look at Africa differently. Thank you.
So I think you can join.
Donc je vais penser que vous pouvez nous rejoindre à remercier nos derniers panélistes avec un tour d'applaudissements. Merci.